In the middle of a tense family argument, my parents sent a group message kicking me out of all decisions. I was heartbroken. But before I could even respond, my aunt replied to the whole group with a screenshot of a legal document. Suddenly, my parents weren't in charge anymore. I've always been the problem child in my family, which is funny because I'm the only one who actually has their life together. My brother Mark has never held a job for more than 2 years. He's constantly starting businesses that fail within months, always coming up with the next big idea that never pans out. My parents fund his dreams without question, calling him ambitious and creative. When I graduated college with a degree in accounting and got a stable job at a good firm, they called it boring. When I bought my own condo at 27, they said I was being too serious for my age. When I suggested we needed to talk about Grandma's future care needs, they said I was being morbid and cruel. That's always been my role. The practical one, the responsible one. The one who thinks ahead and plans for problems before they become crises. And somehow, in my family's eyes, that made me the cold one. The one without feelings. The one who didn't really love anyone because I wasn't constantly drowning in emotion and chaos like the rest of them. Growing up, I learned to accept this role. When I was 12, our dog got sick. Really sick. I was the one who noticed he wasn't eating and was sleeping all the time. I told my parents we needed to take him to the vet right away. My mother said I was overreacting. Mark said I just wanted attention. 3 days later, when the dog collapsed, they rushed him to the emergency vet. The bill was enormous because by then he needed surgery. The dog survived, but I was somehow blamed for not insisting harder. I was 12. When I was 16, I pointed out that my dad's car was making a weird grinding noise. He brushed me off, saying I didn't know anything about cars. 2 weeks later, the transmission died on the highway. He had to pay for a tow and a complete replacement. At dinner that night, he muttered that if someone had told him earlier, it wouldn't have cost so much. I had told him. No one remembered. In college, I called home to warn my parents that Mark's new girlfriend seemed to be isolating him from friends and family. I'd done some research on controlling relationship patterns after seeing some red flags during Thanksgiving break. My mother told me I was jealous that Mark had found love. That girlfriend ended up stealing $3,000 from Mark and disappearing. Somehow, during the tearful family gathering after it happened, my mother mentioned that no one had seen the warning signs. I'd written her a detailed email. She'd deleted it without reading it fully. This was my normal. I saw problems coming. I researched solutions. I presented logical plans. My family ignored me. The crisis happened anyway. And then I was either blamed for not trying hard enough or forgotten entirely when they rewrote history. The only person who ever seemed to see this pattern was my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister. Carol was cut from different cloth than my mom. Where my mother was emotional and reactive, Carol was steady and thoughtful. Where my mother made decisions based on feelings and what looked good to neighbors, Carol made decisions based on facts and actual outcomes. She'd been a nurse for 30 years before retiring, and she had this way of cutting through nonsense that I deeply admired. When the family gathered for holidays, Carol and I often ended up in the kitchen together, talking about real things while everyone else argued or gossiped in the living room. Carol had never married or had kids. She'd focused on her career and her own life, which my mother sometimes made snippy comments about when Carol wasn't around. I think my mom resented that Carol seemed perfectly content without the traditional family structure my mother valued so highly. But Carol and my grandmother, her mother, were extremely close. Carol called her every single day and visited twice a week, even though she lived 40 minutes away. She managed Grandma's medications, took her to doctor appointments, and made sure her house was maintained. My parents lived 10 minutes from Grandma, but visited maybe twice a month. Always making a big dramatic show of it when they did. Grandma was 86 and had been doing pretty well until last October. She was still living in the house she'd shared with my grandfather before he died 12 years ago. She was sharp mentally, keeping up with her shows and doing crossword puzzles every morning. Physically, she'd slowed down, but she could still handle her daily activities with some modifications Carol had helped set up. Then she fell. It was a Wednesday morning. She'd gotten up to make coffee and tripped over the corner of a rug in her hallway. She broke her hip and lay on the floor for 3 hours before her neighbor noticed her newspaper was still on the porch and came to check. The neighbor called 911, and Grandma had emergency surgery that afternoon. Carol called me from the hospital, her voice tight with controlled worry. She'd already called my parents, who were on their way. The surgery went well, but the recovery was brutal. Hip fractures in elderly people are serious business. Grandma spent 2 weeks in the hospital, then another 3 weeks in a rehabilitation facility doing physical therapy. I visited her 4 times during that period, driving the hour and a half each way after work. Carol was there almost daily. My parents visited once a week, each time staying for about 30 minutes before they got uncomfortable and left. Mark visited twice, both times making it about himself and how sad it made him feel. When Grandma was finally discharged, she came home with a walker and a long list of restrictions. She couldn't navigate stairs safely. She couldn't carry anything while using the walker. She tired easily and needed help with bathing and dressing. Carol had taken a leave from her part-time consulting work to stay with Grandma during the day, but it was clear this wasn't sustainable long-term. That's when I started researching options. I spent my evenings after work reading about in-home care, assisted living facilities, and nursing homes. I learned about the differences in levels of care, about what Medicare covered and what it didn't, about warning signs of good and bad facilities. I made spreadsheets comparing costs. I called places to ask about availability and toured 3 different facilities on my day off. One place stood out. Meadowbrook Senior Living was 25 minutes from my condo and 30 minutes from my parents' house. It had excellent online reviews, a clean inspection record, and when I toured it, I was genuinely impressed. The rooms were spacious and bright. The staff seemed attentive and kind. They had a robust activities program and a full-time physical therapist on staff. The dining rooms served actual good food, not the mystery meat mush I'd worried about. Most importantly, they had availability and specialized in post-injury recovery care. I put together a detailed presentation. I'm an accountant, so presentations are kind of my thing. I outlined Grandma's current needs, the limitations of in-home care, the benefits of a facility with 24/7 medical staff, and the costs broken down month by month. I included photos from my tour, testimonials from families, and a comparison of 3 other facilities I'd researched. I sent it to the family group chat with a message saying, we needed to discuss this seriously. The response was immediate and hostile. My mother called me within 10 minutes, her voice shaking with anger. How could I even suggest putting Grandma in a home? Those places were where you sent people to die. Grandma would be heartbroken. She'd feel abandoned. What would the neighbors think? What would the people at church say? On, a stream of emotional reactions with no actual logic behind them. I tried to explain the practical realities. Carol couldn't stay with Grandma indefinitely. Hiring full-time in-home care would actually cost more per month than the assisted living facility. Grandma needed physical therapy to regain her strength, and doing it consistently at home was difficult. The facility had social activities that would help with her mental health. Grandma would be safer with medical professionals nearby in case of another fall or emergency. My mother wasn't hearing any of it. She said, I was being heartless, that I just wanted to shove Grandma away so I wouldn't have to think about her. That I clearly didn't love my grandmother the way everyone else did. Mark jumped on the call at some point and backed her up, saying he'd been thinking about moving in with Grandma to take care of her himself. This was laughable since Mark could barely take care of his own apartment. But my mother immediately latched onto the idea as proof that some people in the family actually cared. My dad got on and played his usual role of trying to keep the peace while ultimately siding with my mother. He said, maybe we were rushing into things. Maybe we should try in-home care first. Maybe Grandma would get stronger and be able to live independently again. He suggested we table the discussion and revisit it in a few months. I pointed out that waiting months wasn't practical. Grandma needed consistent care now. Carol couldn't put her life on hold indefinitely. The facility had availability now, but might not later. Making decisions based on wishful thinking rather than reality was how problems got worse. This, predictably, went over like a lead balloon. The call ended with my mother saying she needed to pray about it, and my dad saying they'd figure something out. Mark made some comment about how not everyone measured life in spreadsheets and dollars. I sat in my condo afterward feeling that familiar mix of frustration and resignation. I'd done the work, I'd found the solution, and I was being painted as the villain for it. Carol called me an hour later. She'd received angry calls from my mother and father complaining about my pushiness. Carol, in her usual straightforward way, said she agreed with everything in my presentation. She thought the facility was the right choice. She'd actually been thinking the same thing, but hadn't brought it up yet because she was trying to let the family process Grandma's injury first. She said she'd try to talk some sense into my mother, but we both knew how that usually went. Over the next 2 weeks, the tension escalated. My parents started having family meetings that I wasn't invited to. They'd discuss options in the group chat during hours they knew I was at work, making decisions, and then presenting them as if they were already settled. First, it was that Mom would cut back her hours at her part-time bookkeeping job to help with Grandma more. Never mind that she'd never handled any kind of medical care before and got squeamish around anything health-related. Then it was that they'd hire a part-time home health aide for a few hours a day. I asked who would coordinate that care, who would supervise to make sure the aide was actually doing their job, who would handle it if the aide called in sick. These questions were treated as me being negative and looking for problems. Mark announced he was definitely moving in with Grandma. When I asked practical questions about how he'd afford his current rent while living there, who would cover his expenses, how he'd handle her medication schedule and physical therapy appointments, he got defensive. He said some things were more important than money. That real family stepped up instead of looking for excuses. My mother praised him for his sacrifice and his huge heart. I did the math. If Mark moved in, he'd stop paying rent on his apartment. Grandma's house was fully paid off. He'd essentially be living rent-free while claiming to be a caretaker. And knowing Mark's history, he'd probably convince my parents to give him money for his time and effort. Plus, he'd have access to Grandma's house and finances. This had disaster written all over it. Carol saw it too. She started asking pointed questions in the group chat about the specific plan. What medical training did Mark have? Would he be there 24/7? Or would he still need to work? What was the backup plan for when he inevitably got overwhelmed or lost interest? My parents got defensive on Mark's behalf, saying Carol was being unsupportive. Things came to a head 3 weeks after I'd sent my initial presentation. I'd called my mother to try one more time to discuss the assisted living option rationally. I'd gotten the financial breakdown from Meadowbrook and had compared it directly with the costs of adequate in-home care. When you factored in a proper health aide for the hours Grandma actually needed coverage, plus the physical therapist visits, plus medications, plus food delivery since Grandma couldn't cook safely anymore, plus emergency backup care for when the regular aide couldn't make it, the numbers weren't even close. The facility was actually cheaper and provided better, more consistent care. My mother didn't want to hear the numbers. She kept interrupting me with emotional appeals. What about Grandma's feelings? What about her dignity? What about keeping her in her own home where she'd lived for 40 years? I tried to explain that Grandma's safety had to come first. That dignity wasn't about location, it was about receiving proper care. That we had to deal with reality, not our ideal fantasy of how things should be. That's when my mother said it. She said maybe I wasn't the right person to be involved in these decisions, that my approach was causing stress for everyone, that the family needed to come together in love, not logic. I felt something crack in my chest. After all the work I'd done, all the research and tours and phone calls, I was being pushed out for actually caring enough to face hard truths. I said some things I probably shouldn't have. I pointed out that I'd been the only one other than Carol actually doing anything useful. That visiting Grandma for 30 minutes and crying didn't constitute a care plan. That Mark couldn't even remember to water his own plants, let alone manage another person's complex medical needs. That their refusal to face reality was going to result in Grandma getting hurt or not receiving the care she deserved. That I was tired of being treated like the bad guy for being the only responsible person in the family. My mother's voice went cold. She said she'd discuss it with my father and Mark. Then she hung up on me. I knew that tone. That was the tone that meant I'd crossed a line, and there would be consequences. The consequences came the next morning. I was at my desk at work, halfway through reviewing a client's quarterly taxes, when my phone buzzed with a notification from the family group chat. The chat included me, my parents, Mark, Carol, and my dad's brother, Uncle Jim. Though Jim rarely participated since he lived out of state. The message was from my father, but I could tell my mother had dictated it, or at least heavily influenced the wording. It read, "Sarah, after much discussion, we feel your approach to Grandma's care is causing too much distress for the family. We think it's best you step away from these decisions for now. We will handle it as a family. We love you, but we need to do what's best for Mom in a spirit of compassion, not just practicality." I stared at my phone screen, reading the words over and over. The corporate language, the false kindness, the way they'd framed it as me being the problem. The casual cruelty of doing it in the group chat where everyone could see my exile. I felt hot tears prick my eyes and blinked them back furiously. I was at work. I couldn't fall apart at work. My hands were shaking as I set my phone face down on my desk. I tried to refocus on the tax forms in front of me, but the numbers blurred. The gut punch feeling wouldn't fade. This was different from the usual dismissal of my ideas. This was formal rejection. A public removal from the family's inner circle. I'd been labeled too difficult, too cold, too problematic to be included in decisions about my own grandmother. The worst part was the humiliation of it being in the group chat. Carol had seen it. Uncle Jim had seen it. They'd put my exile on display. It felt intentional, like they wanted to make sure everyone knew I was being pushed out and why. They wanted Carol and Jim to see their version of events, where I was the unreasonable one causing problems. I made it through the workday on autopilot. I finished the tax review. I attended a meeting about a new client. I responded to emails. But my mind was spinning the entire time. I kept picking up my phone to check if anyone had responded to the message, but the chat stayed silent. No one was defending me. No one was questioning the decision. The message just sat there like a tombstone marking the death of my place in the family. By the time I got home to my condo that evening, the shock had worn off and anger was taking its place. I paced my living room, too worked up to sit down. I'd done everything right. I'd seen the problem coming. I'd researched solutions. I'd presented options clearly and thoroughly. I'd asked the hard questions no one else wanted to ask. And for that, I was being kicked out. Meanwhile, Mark, who'd never successfully taken care of anything in his life, was being praised as the golden child stepping up. My parents, who visited Grandma twice a month and couldn't handle watching her struggle with physical therapy without getting weepy, were taking control. Carol, who'd actually been doing the daily work of caring for Grandma, was being sidelined too. Though, at least they hadn't formally kicked her out of the chat. I pulled up the group chat on my phone about a dozen times, typing and deleting responses. Part of me wanted to lay into them, to list every single time I'd been right and they'd been wrong, to point out Mark's failures and their enabling, to highlight their hypocrisy, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They'd just use it as more proof that I was angry and difficult. Another part of me wanted to beg, to apologize for being too blunt and promise to be softer, to ask for another chance to be included. But that made me feel sick. I hadn't done anything wrong. Why should I apologize for caring enough to be honest? I was still pacing, still picking up and setting down my phone, still cycling through anger and hurt, when a new notification popped up on my screen. The family group chat. Someone had responded. I felt my stomach clench, bracing for Mark to pile on or my mother to add some passive-aggressive comment about forgiveness and family. But it wasn't from Mark or my parents. It was from Carol. And it wasn't a text message. It was an image, a screenshot. My hands were shaking again as I tapped to expand the image. It took a second for my brain to process what I was seeing. It was a legal document. The header read, "Durable Power of Attorney for Healthcare and Financial Decisions." The document was dated 7 years ago. And there, highlighted in bright yellow on Carol's screenshot, were 2 names listed as having joint authority to make all healthcare and financial decisions on behalf of my grandmother. The first name was my mother's, the second name was Carol's. I stopped pacing. My living room went very quiet except for the hum of my refrigerator. I read the names again, making sure I was understanding correctly. Joint authority? Both names. Either could act, but for major decisions, both had to agree. And my father wasn't listed. Mark wasn't listed. It was just my mother and Carol. Before I could fully process the implications, another message from Carol appeared in the chat. This one was text, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever read. "Since you've decided to sideline the one person who has done all the actual work, I am now exercising my full legal authority as Mom's POA. All decisions regarding her care and finances will go through me, effective immediately. I agree with Sarah's recommendation for the facility, and that is what we will be doing. I will be at your house tomorrow at 10 a.m. to begin a full review of Mom's financial accounts to facilitate the transition. Please have all paperwork ready." I read the message 3 times. Then I sat down hard on my couch, my legs suddenly unable to hold me up. Carol had just dropped a nuclear bomb into the family chat. She'd pulled out legal documentation that apparently everyone had forgotten about and used my exile as the trigger to take complete control. My phone started buzzing, not with group chat messages, but with individual texts and calls, first from my mother, then my father, then Mark. I watched them light up my screen and didn't answer any of them. My mother's texts started appearing in preview on my lock screen. "Sarah, call me right now." "This is a misunderstanding. You need to talk to Carol. Please pick up the phone." I didn't respond. I just sat on my couch, staring at the screenshot Carol had sent, feeling something I hadn't expected. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. For the first time in my entire life, someone with actual power had stepped in on my side. Someone had seen what was happening and hadn't just sympathized privately, but had acted publicly. Carol had used her legal authority to protect both Grandma and me from my parents' emotional denial and Mark's manipulation. The calls kept coming. My father left a voicemail. I could hear the panic in his voice even through the phone speaker. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk about this. Carol is upset and she's not thinking clearly. That message in the group chat, it didn't come out right. We weren't trying to hurt you. Please call us back so we can figure this out." Figure this out. Translation: Please help us undo the consequences of our actions. Please convince Carol to stand down. Please let us go back to the status quo where we made emotional decisions and you absorbed the blame. Mark left a voicemail too. His was more aggressive. Sarah, I don't know what you said to Aunt Carol, but you need to fix this. She can't just take over everything. Mom and Dad have rights too. This is messed up and you know it. Call me back. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. They genuinely seemed to think I had orchestrated this, that I had somehow manipulated Carol into pulling out a 7-year-old legal document and asserting her authority. They couldn't conceive that Carol had simply seen an unjust situation and acted on her own judgment. My phone buzzed with a call from Carol herself. This one I answered. "Hey," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Hey, Carol said. She sounded calm, almost amused. "I assume you've seen the fireworks? I've gotten about 15 calls and texts in the last 10 minutes. I bet you have. Are you okay?" The simple question made my throat tight. "I think so. Carol, I had no idea about the power of attorney." "I know you didn't. Your grandmother set it up after your grandfather died. She wanted to make sure someone could help her if she ever couldn't make decisions herself. She chose your mother and me jointly. Your mother either forgot about it or was hoping everyone else had." "Did you really mean it? About taking over?" There was a pause. When Carol spoke again, her voice was firm. "Sarah, I've watched your family scapegoat you for years. I've bitten my tongue more times than I can count because I didn't want to cause family drama. But kicking you out of decisions about your grandmother's care when you're the only one who's actually done the work, that was the last straw. Yes, I meant every word. I'm going to your parents' house tomorrow, and I'm going to review your grandmother's finances. And then we're going to move her to that facility you found because it's the right thing to do. They're going to fight you on this. Let them try. I have the legal paperwork. Do they?" Carol's tone was dry. "Look, I'm not doing this to punish anyone. I'm doing this because your grandmother deserves proper care, not whatever half-baked plan your parents and Mark were going to cobble together. And because you deserved better than that message they sent. You've been doing this alone for too long." I felt tears sliding down my face, the good kind this time. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow is going to be ugly. Do you want to come with me for moral support?" I thought about it. Part of me wanted to stay far away from the inevitable confrontation. But another part of me, the part that had been beaten down and blamed for years, wanted to be there. Wanted to see my parents face the consequences of their decision. "What time?" "Meet me at the coffee shop on Maple Street at 9. We'll go in together." "I'll be there." After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room and watched my phone continue to light up with calls and messages. My mother was cycling through anger and pleading. My father was trying to be reasonable and diplomatic. Mark was just angry, sending increasingly hostile texts about betrayal and family loyalty. I turned my phone on Do Not Disturb and went to bed early. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. The next morning, I called in sick to work. My boss was understanding when I said there was a family emergency. If she heard the edge of satisfaction in my voice, she didn't comment. I met Carol at the coffee shop at 9 exactly. She was already there, sitting at a corner table with a large folder of documents in front of her. She looked professional and prepared, wearing slacks and a blazer. When she saw me, she smiled. "Ready for this?" "I think so." "What's in the folder?" "Copies of the power of attorney, the original document naming me as joint decision maker, records of all the calls I've made to facilities and doctors, and a detailed care plan I put together last night. I want everything documented. If your parents try to fight this legally, I want a paper trail showing I acted in your grandmother's best interest. Do you think they'll actually try to fight it legally? Carol's expression hardened. I don't know. I'd like to think your mother wouldn't go that far, but after that stunt yesterday, I'm not sure what she's capable of. That's why we're going to do this by the book. We drove separately to my parents' house, arriving at exactly 10. My mother's car was in the driveway along with my father's truck and Mark's beat-up sedan. They were all home, waiting. I felt my stomach knot as Carol and I walked up to the front door together. Carol rang the doorbell instead of just walking in, a power move that established this as official business rather than a casual family visit. My father opened the door. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes. Carol, Sarah, he said my name with a mix of relief and worry. Come in. The living room felt like a courtroom. My mother was sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, her face set in angry lines. Mark was standing by the window, practically vibrating with hostility. My father took a seat in his recliner and gestured for Carol and me to sit. Carol remained standing. We're not here for a long visit. I'm here to review Mom's financial documents and to discuss her care plan going forward. Carol, this is ridiculous, my mother said, her voice sharp. You can't just commandeer everything because you're upset. I'm not commandeering anything. I'm exercising the legal authority Mom gave me 7 years ago. Carol placed the folder on the coffee table and pulled out the power of attorney document. This is a legal, notarized document stating that you and I have joint authority over all healthcare and financial decisions for Mom. I'm sure you remember signing the companion document for your own authority. My mother's face flushed. That was just a formality, a safety measure, in case something happened. Something did happen. Mom fell, broke her hip, and can no longer live independently. That's exactly the situation this document was created for. Carol's voice was calm but firm. Now, I need to see all of Mom's financial statements, bank accounts, investment accounts, any retirement funds, and records of all expenses for the past 2 years. Why do you need 2 years of expenses? My father asked. Because I need to understand her financial position completely before we move her to a facility. I need to know what she can afford and for how long. My mother stood up abruptly. This is about that facility Sarah picked out, isn't it? You two have been plotting this together. I didn't know anything about the POA until Carol posted it in the chat, I said quietly. And I haven't talked to Carol about any of this except when she called me last night. I find that hard to believe, Mark said from his position by the window. This is all pretty convenient, isn't it? You get kicked out, and suddenly Aunt Carol swoops in with legal papers. The timing is convenient because you made it convenient, Carol said, turning to face Mark. If you hadn't pushed to exclude Sarah, I would have continued working with your parents to find a solution. But when you kicked out the person who actually did the work, I realized this family isn't capable of making rational decisions right now. So I'm making them. You can't just take over Mom's life, my mother said, her voice rising. She's my mother. I have rights. You have equal rights to mine, which means I can block any decision you try to make that I believe isn't in Mom's best interest. And I can make decisions you don't like, as long as they are in her best interest. Carol's voice didn't rise to match my mother's. Now, are you going to get me those financial documents, or do I need to go to the banks directly? Because I have the legal authority to do that. The silence that followed was thick and hostile. My father finally stood up. I'll get the papers. He left the room, and the rest of us stood in awkward silence. My mother was staring at Carol with a look of betrayal. Mark was glaring at me like this was all my fault. I kept my face neutral and stayed quiet. This was Carol's show. My father returned with a cardboard file box and set it on the coffee table. Everything should be in here. Bank statements, investment quarterly reports, bills. Carol sat down and began going through the papers methodically. I sat in a chair across from her, watching. My parents and Mark sat down too, creating a strange tableau of family meeting gone wrong. As Carol sorted through statements and made notes, I saw her expression change. Her mouth tightened. Her eyes narrowed. She pulled out a series of bank statements and laid them side by side, studying them carefully. "These withdrawals?" Carol said, pointing to several large amounts highlighted on the statements. "What are these for?" My father and mother exchanged a glance. "Just expenses," my mother said vaguely. "Mom's expenses. These are cash withdrawals of $2,000 each, made monthly for the past 18 months. That's $36,000. Carol looked up, her gaze sharp. "What expenses required that much cash?" Another exchange of glances. "Various things," my father said. "Home repairs, medical copays, groceries." Carol pulled out more statements. "And these transfers to an external account? 5,000 here, 3,000 there, 7,500 here. That's another 40,000 over 2 years." The room went very quiet. I looked at my parents with growing realization. Mark was staring at the floor. "Where did the money go?" Carol asked, her voice dangerously calm. "We borrowed it," my mother finally said, her voice defensive. "We were going to pay it back." "Borrowed it for what?" "Mark's business ventures," my father said quietly, "and some home repairs on our house. And we helped Mark with his rent a few times when he was between jobs." Carol was very still. "You took over $75,000 from your mother's savings to fund Mark's failed businesses." "We were going to pay it back," my mother repeated. "And they weren't all failures. Some of them just needed more time." "Does Mom know about this?" Silence. "Does she know?" Carol's voice was harder now. "We didn't want to worry her," my father said. "She has plenty of money. She won't miss it." "She has plenty of money until she needs to pay for care," Carol said. "This assisted living facility costs $4,500 a month. That $75,000 you borrowed would have covered a year and a half of care." I felt sick. This was why they'd been so resistant to the facility. It wasn't really about wanting to keep Grandma at home out of love. It was about avoiding the financial transparency that would reveal what they'd done. "This is why you wanted Mark to move in with her," I said, the pieces clicking into place. "Free rent for him, and you could keep controlling her money without oversight." "That's not fair," Mark said, finally looking up. "I was genuinely going to take care of her." "For how long?" Carol asked. "Until you got bored? Till the next business idea came along? Until you decided caregiving was too hard?" She gathered the statements back into a neat pile. "Here's what's going to happen. First, all of you are going to sign a promissory note for the $75,000 you took. You'll pay it back at $500 a month until it's settled. That will be legally documented." "We don't have $500 a month," my mother protested. "Then I suggest you pick up extra hours or Mark gets a stable job. Because if you don't agree to this, I will pursue legal action for elder financial abuse. Do you understand what that would mean?" My parents' faces went pale. Elder financial abuse was a serious crime. It could mean criminal charges, fines, even jail time. "Second," Carol continued, "Mom will be moved to Meadowbrook Senior Living within 2 weeks. Sarah has already done the research and toured the facility. I will handle all the logistics." "You can't make this decision without me," my mother said. "I'm her daughter. I have power of attorney too." "You're right. You do have joint authority, which means if you want to fight me on this, we can take it to court and let a judge decide if your judgment is sound. I'll present evidence that you've stolen $75,000 from the person you're supposed to be protecting. How do you think that will go?" My mother's eyes filled with angry tears, but she didn't respond. "Third," Carol said, "going forward, all decisions about Mom's care and finances will be made by Sarah and me. You're welcome to visit her. You're welcome to be involved in her life, but you will not have access to her money and you will not make care decisions. You can't cut us out, my father said. She's our mother. I'm not cutting you out of her life. I'm cutting you out of control you've proven you can't handle responsibly. Carol stood up, gathering her folder. You have until Monday to decide. Either you sign the promissory note and agree to the care plan, or I go to an attorney and we do this the hard way. Your choice. Mark finally exploded. This is such bullshit. Sarah comes in here with her spreadsheets and her judgmental attitude, and now you're acting like we're criminals? We're family. We were trying to help each other out. You stole from an elderly woman, I said. My voice steady despite the anger coursing through me. You can dress it up however you want, but that's what happened. We borrowed from Mom, Mark shot back. There's a difference. Did you ask her permission? She would have said yes. But you didn't ask, because you knew what you were doing was wrong. I stood up too, facing my brother. You've been coasting on other people's money your whole life, Mark, and Mom and Dad have enabled it. But this time, you stole from Grandma, and there are actual consequences. You self-righteous Mark started stepping toward me. Enough. Carol's voice cracked like a whip. Mark, you're a 32-year-old man who has never taken responsibility for anything in your life. Your parents have bankrupted themselves trying to fund your delusions. Now, they've stolen from your grandmother to continue the pattern. If you want to be angry at someone, be angry at yourself. You have no right, my mother said, tears streaming down her face now. You've always looked down on us. You've always thought you were better because you had your fancy career and your independence. You don't understand what it's like to be a mother, to want to help your child succeed. Helping your child and enabling your child are different things, Carol said. And stealing from your mother to do it crosses every line there is. I'm not looking down on you. I'm holding you accountable. She headed for the door and I followed. My father called after us. Carol, wait. We can talk about this. Carol paused at the door and turned back. You have until Monday, 5 p.m. If I don't hear from you by then, I'm filing a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services and consulting with an attorney about financial abuse charges. We walked out, leaving them in their living room with the wreckage of their choices scattered across the coffee table in the form of bank statements. I made it to my car before I started shaking. Carol walked over and leaned against the driver's side door. You okay? I think so. That was intense. That was necessary, Sarah. Did you have any idea they were taking money from your grandmother? No, but it makes so much sense now. Why they were so defensive, why they didn't want any outside facility involved. Carol shook her head. $75,000. I knew your parents enabled Mark, but I didn't think they'd go this far. What happens if they don't sign the promissory note? Then I follow through on my threat. I report them and we let the legal system handle it. Carol's expression was grim. I don't want to do that. They're still family, but I won't let them keep taking advantage of Mom. Will Grandma have enough money for the facility even with what they took? Yes. She has her Social Security, a decent pension from when your grandfather worked at the plant, and her savings. Even with $75,000 missing, she can afford several years of care. But if they'd kept going, if Mark had moved in and they'd kept draining her accounts, she could have been in real trouble. I thought about that alternate timeline. Grandma running out of money, a crisis hitting. My parents suddenly unable to fund her care because they'd spent it all on Mark's schemes. The whole family imploding. Thank you, I said again, for doing this, for standing up. Carol smiled, but it was tired. Someone had to. And I'm sorry I waited so long. I should have stepped in years ago when I saw how they treated you. You're stepping in now. That's what matters. We said our goodbyes, and I drove home. The rest of the weekend was quiet. My parents didn't call. Mark sent one more nasty text that I blocked. Carol checked in on Saturday to let me know she'd spoken with Grandma and explained everything. Grandma had been appalled to learn about the money and fully supported Carol's plan. She said she was actually looking forward to the facility because she was lonely in her house and missed having people around. Monday afternoon, Carol called. They signed. Your dad brought the signed promissory note to my office at 4:30. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. They've agreed to everything. The repayment plan, the facility, our decision-making authority. How did my mom take it? I don't know. Your dad came alone. He said your mother was too upset to come, but that she'd agreed. He asked if there was any way we could keep this quiet, not tell extended family or friends. What did you say? I said I wasn't planning to broadcast it, but I also wasn't going to lie if people asked questions. This is on them, not us. Over the next 2 weeks, Carol and I worked together to transition Grandma to Meadowbrook. We packed up her essentials, set up her room at the facility, and managed all the paperwork. My parents came to say goodbye the day before the move. It was awkward and stilted. My mother cried. My father hugged Grandma and apologized, though he didn't specify what for. Mark didn't come. I didn't go to that goodbye. I'd said my own goodbye to Grandma earlier in the week, just the two of us. She'd held my hands and told me she was proud of me for standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. She said she wished she'd been stronger when my parents were raising me, that she'd seen how they treated me differently than Mark, but hadn't intervened. I told her it wasn't her fault. We both cried a little, the good kind of crying that comes with honesty. The day of the move went smoothly. Grandma settled into her room at Meadowbrook like she'd been waiting for permission to enjoy it. The staff was warm and welcoming. Her room had a big window overlooking a garden. By the end of the first day, she'd already made friends with 2 other residents and signed up for a watercolor painting class. I visited her twice a week. Carol came 3 times a week. My parents came once every 2 weeks, staying for an hour or so each time. The visits were polite but distant. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't talk about much of anything real. Mark never visited at all. He'd moved back in with my parents to save money so they could afford the repayment plan. According to Grandma, who heard it from my mother, he was working at a warehouse and hating every minute of it. I felt a small, petty satisfaction at that. 3 months after Grandma moved into Meadowbrook, Carol and I met for dinner at a nice Italian place downtown. It had become a regular thing for us, meeting every couple of weeks to catch up and coordinate on Grandma's care. She's doing really well, Carol said, twirling pasta on her fork. Her physical therapist says she's gotten a lot of her strength back. She's even using a cane instead of the walker most days. I noticed that last time I visited. She seems happy. She is. She told me yesterday that she wishes she'd moved to a place like this years ago, that she's less lonely than she was in that big house by herself. We ate in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Carol said, "How are you doing?" "With your parents." I considered the question. Honestly, I'm okay. It hurts that we barely speak now. It hurts that they still can't admit they were wrong, but I also feel lighter, if that makes sense. I'm not carrying around the weight of constantly trying to prove myself. It makes perfect sense. You've been beating your head against a wall for years. Now you can stop. Do you think they'll ever really understand what they did? To Grandma? To me? Carol shook her head slowly. I don't know. Some people can't see past their own narrative. Your mother has always seen herself as a devoted parent doing her best. Accepting that she enabled Mark at everyone else's expense, that she scapegoated you, that she stole from her own mother, that's a lot to face. It's easier to stay in denial and paint me as the villain who came in and ruined everything. Is that what she tells people? I've heard through the grapevine that the family story is that I manipulated the situation to take control and turned you against them, that we're keeping them from their mother. I laughed, but it was bitter. Of course, that's the story. Let them tell whatever story they need to tell. The people who matter know the truth. That became my mantra over the following months. Let them tell their story. I knew the truth. Carol knew the truth. Grandma knew the truth. Grandma thrived at Meadowbrook. 6 months in, she was leading the book club and had become best friends with her neighbor, a retired teacher named Dorothy. Her physical health had stabilized. Her mental health had actually improved with the regular social interaction and activities. My relationship with my parents remained distant. We exchanged pleasantries at holidays. I saw them at Grandma's birthday party at the facility. We were polite, even cordial, but there was no real warmth. The family group chat still existed, but it was mostly just Carol and me coordinating logistics now. My parents rarely posted. Mark and I didn't speak at all. I'd hear updates through Grandma occasionally. He was still at the warehouse, still living with my parents, still convinced he was the victim in all of this. A year after the confrontation, I was promoted to senior accountant at my firm. Carol took me out to celebrate. Over champagne, she raised her glass. To standing your ground, to having backup when it matters, I countered. We clinked glasses. Do you ever regret how it all went down? Carol asked. How it fractured the family? I thought about it. A year ago, the question would have filled me with guilt and doubt. Now, I could answer honestly, no. They fractured the family when they kicked me out for being right, when they stole from Grandma, when they chose Mark's ego over everyone else's well-being. You and I just stopped pretending it wasn't broken. That's a healthy way to look at it. I learned from the best. I smiled at my aunt, this woman who'd stepped in when it mattered most. You changed everything when you sent that screenshot. You changed everything when you refused to back down. I just provided the legal ammunition. Maybe we were both right. Maybe it took both of us, the person willing to stand up and the person with the power to back them up. My family tried to silence me, but they forgot about the one person who had my back and the paperwork to prove it. Some people might think Carol went too far. That family should forgive and accommodate and bend over backward to keep the peace. But I think my parents got exactly what they deserved. They made their choices, they faced the consequences, and Grandma got the care she needed, surrounded by people who actually put her first. In the end, being pushed out of my family's inner circle wasn't an ending. It was a liberation. The group text that was meant to exile me became the catalyst for breaking free from a toxic dynamic that had defined my entire life. I lost the family I'd been trying to please for 30 years, but I gained something better: respect, peace, and a relationship with Carol and Grandma built on honesty instead of dysfunction. That's worth more than any group chat could ever be. My family tried to silence me, but they forgot about the one person who had my back and the paperwork to prove it. Do you think my aunt went too far? Or did my parents get exactly what they deserved? Let me know in the comments.